Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back, way back, to one of humanity's first cities. Picture this: dusty heat rising from sun-baked brick walls, the scent of sheep, dates, and simmering lentils in the air, and an endless thrum of voices, negotiating everything from marriage dowries to barley prices. You're standing in Ur, yes, the very Ur that shows up in every ancient history textbook. But tonight, we're slowing things down. We're here not to admire the ziggurats or catalog, gods with 5-syllable names. We're here to watch someone write a complaint. That's right, the first known customer service rant. So detailed, so passive-aggressive, so deeply petty it survived 3,800 years. You probably won't survive this world, though. No plumbing, no sleep schedule. And yes, everyone's yelling in cuneiform. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious who's falling asleep with me across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a hard-packed street, sandals scuffing over centuries of compacted dust. Ur, at the height of its glory in the 18th century BCE, doesn't look like the cracked ruins you may have seen in documentaries. It's alive, loud, and surprisingly crowded. You sidestep a goat, then a priest with a truly unfortunate haircut, and dodge a group of boys slinging mud at a temple wall. The air buzzes with barter. High above, ziggurats loom like giant wedding cakes baked in brick. Down here, you're in the maze, the merchant quarters. Storefronts open onto the street, with makeshift awnings flapping in the wind. Crates of copper ingots, rolls of woven linen, and sacks of emmer wheat spill into alleyways. You pause outside a copper merchant's stall. A man is shouting at a clerk who's half listening while inspecting a papyrus-wrapped lunch. The customer, reddened, face wild gestures, is clearly not impressed with his purchase. This is where our story begins. See, you're in a city that breathes bureaucracy. The Mesopotamians didn't just invent writing for poetry and the occasional religious drama. No, they wrote for trade, for math, for inventory, for complaints. They wrote a lot. Reeds dipped in thick black ink? That would have been too easy. Instead, they used a stylus made from a carved reed to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. It's called cuneiform, literally wedge-shaped writing. Once written, the tablet was either left to air dry or fired in a kiln, depending on how permanent the scribe wanted it. And if permanence was the goal, say, in the case of a merchant who got scammed, those little tablets could last thousands of years, like the one we'll come to soon. But first, feel the texture of Ur. The air smells of dust and cumin, carried on the wind from nearby spice markets. Somewhere, a temple bell rings, a dull thunk like someone hitting a gong with a handful of bread dough. You pass by a tablet shop. It's not called that, obviously, but rows and rows of hardened clay rectangles rest on wooden slats. Some are legal records, others are letters, a few are love poems. One appears to be a truly unhinged piece of erotic fan fiction involving a demigod and a cow. The scribe, a lanky man with dark crescents under his eyes, sips something that may or may not be date beer. He doesn't look up. This is how Ur worked. Letters were written, delivered, answered, or ignored. No return address, no inbox. But there was a record. And Mesopotamians were all about keeping records. Not just the kings and priests, but regular people too, especially when they felt wronged. Your feet ache. The ground is uneven, scattered with pottery shards and the occasional half-squashed fig. But you're not done yet. You turn a corner and walk past a group of temple students reciting hymns in a sing-song chant, each holding a practice tablet. One drops his. The clay shatters. The instructor sighs. This will not be a forgiving lesson. Fun fact: Mesopotamian scribes trained for years. They memorized thousands of symbols, starting from childhood. School wasn't just tough, it was brutal. There's even a surviving text where a student complains that his tablet was smashed and he was beaten for not memorizing his signs fast enough. Historians still argue whether that tablet was real or a form of dark educational satire. But let's get back to our story. You approach the city's edge, where foreign traders unload goods, brightly patterned robes from the Indus Valley, blue lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from, well, that's where things get messy. Copper was everything here. Used for tools, decorations, even dental picks if you were unlucky. And it wasn't always pure, which is precisely why our copper buyer, Nanny, got so upset. In this part of there's tension. Not dramatic, just the kind of frayed corner. Stress you feel when something's been delivered late. Or not at all. A pack animal brays. A merchant sighs deeply into his hands. And somewhere, a scribe sharpens his stylus, preparing to immortalize the world's first bad review. Let that sink in. While ancient kings were inscribing epic conquests and divine rituals, one very regular guy was writing to say, "Your service was bad, and I am not happy." You're still standing near the edge of soaking in the blend of irritation and sun-warmed dust that hangs like invisible laundry across the merchant quarter. Somewhere nearby, a copper ingot gets dropped with a heavy thunk, echoing slightly, against the surrounding brick walls. You turn your head, and there it is, the reason why Mesopotamia works. Bureaucracy in a box. To be precise, a small wooden box, filled with wet clay tablets. The scribe seated beside it looks bored in the way. Only someone surrounded by chaos but numb to it can manage. His robes are speckled with dried clay, his stylus tucked behind one ear, and his expression says, "I've written too many receipts today to care about your petty war over 20 minas of copper." Still, he gestures lazily at the tablet. Supply when a courier boy skids to a halt nearby, panting and clutching a coin for service. You crouch to observe more closely. The process is oddly elegant for something involving a ball of mud. First, the scribe smooths the clay. Not too soft, not too dry, just right for inscribing. Then he dips his stylus and begins pressing it into the surface, each wedge-shaped stroke placed with practiced rhythm. This, in Mesopotamia, is how business gets done. Not with handshakes or emails, but with tiny triangles poked into wet dirt. And there's a reason for it. Writing in Mesopotamia wasn't born from poetry or prayers. It came from the need to count. Count sheep, count jars of beer, count how many loaves of bread one worker should get per day, based on a complex social hierarchy that probably made sense to absolutely no one, even then. The very first known written texts, their inventory, records, lists, numbers. Quaint, right? Except Mesopotamians took it seriously. Even a minor sale could be documented with obsessive detail. Quantities, names, delivery routes, gods invoked as witnesses, and usually the reason why someone was already regretting the deal. You stroll past a covered stall where another scribe has written something truly epic. A contract for a goat exchange, apparently, that includes not only the goat's color but its behavior. Docile but unpredictable near figs. There's also a line about divine punishment should the buyer back out. Yes, they invoke the gods for goat deals. Meanwhile, a merchant seated nearby eyes you suspiciously. He clutches a finished tablet to his chest as though it contains state secrets. Maybe it does. Or maybe it's just another sales log that reads, "To Hammurabi, 5 baskets of millet delivered with 1 noticeable weevil, apology enclosed." It's easy to laugh, but this system worked. And the reeds. Oh, the reeds. You walk toward the Euphrates, where thin stalks grow tall and green in the marshy banks. They don't look like much, but split the stem, cut it at an angle, and voila, you've got your writing tool, the stylus. It's a quiet moment by the water, which is rare. You squat and trace your finger through the mud, then imagine what it would be like to sit for hours, hunched, tapping tiny shapes onto clay, recording the lives of people who wanted, no, needed to be remembered. Some tablets were meant to last days, others centuries. Temporary ones were dried in the sun, like notes you stick on a fridge and forget. But if permanence was the goal, they fired those tablets in kilns. That's why we still have them. You glance up at a merchant mid-argument with a delivery worker, and a sentence rises unbidden. "You did not do what you promised me." It's the opening line from one of the most famous complaint tablets ever written. But we'll get there. Right now you're wondering, how did these tablets move around? There was no postal service, no inbox. But there was a delivery system, sort of, couriers. Often young boys, sometimes hired messengers, and occasionally temple staff if the tablet was religious enough. They carried the clay tablets in padded satchels or wooden containers, sometimes even with wax seals to prove they hadn't been tampered with. Some tablets were wrapped in clay envelopes that had to be broken open. That's right, the original unboxing experience, and you thought your inbox was overwhelming. One particularly sweaty-looking courier stumbles by, clutching a bundle that rattles gently. He's mumbling what sounds like a prayer, probably hoping the gods won't smite him for breaking another tablet. The street is uneven after all, and clay is unforgiving. Historians still argue whether couriers had specific routes, or if delivery was more of a hope it gets there situation. Some suspect temples kept loose records of which courier took what tablet where, while others think it was more like Uber, but with sandals and divine oversight. Either way, imagine walking from to a nearby city, say Larsa, carrying a tablet with someone else's angry complaint about bad copper. You're hungry, it's hot, and you really want to read the drama inside, but the envelope's sealed in clay. Sorry. Back in you follow the courier to a merchant's stall. A tablet is exchanged, grumbles are traded, and then, just like that, it's in the merchant's hands. A complaint. Written by a man who wasn't just mad, he was historically mad. But before we dive into the words that sparked 3 millennia of bureaucratic solidarity, take a second to appreciate the absurdity. Thousands of years ago, someone got so frustrated by poor customer service that they didn't just grumble. They made a permanent clay record of their displeasure, and it still exists. Somewhere, a museum light hums quietly above that very tablet, its cuneiform grooves frozen mid-gripe. You take a deep breath. The river flows on. The city bustles. And the reeds, those humble pointy sticks, wait patiently to shape the next complaint. You're now drifting through the quieter alleyways of where the city breathes more gently, and the air holds a trace of incense from a nearby temple. A goat bleats softly in the distance, possibly the unpredictable fig goat again, and the cobbled streets seem to guide you toward one clay tablet in particular. Not just any tablet, but the ancient equivalent of a Yelp review that was so iconic. It survived fire, conquest, and time itself. You come upon a shaded corner of the merchant quarter where an older scribe leans over a tablet, slowly reading it aloud to a pair of squinting apprentices. The man's tone is dry, but the words, well, they practically sizzle. This is what Nani, son of Idinsin, wrote to Ea Nasir. Ah yes, that letter. If Mesopotamian complaint letters were an art form, and really they were, this is the Mona Lisa. The OG customer dissatisfaction rant. You kneel beside the group to listen. It begins with the simmering understatement of a truly irritated man. Nani had ordered copper ingots from Ea Nasir, a merchant based in and had sent his servants to collect them. But what he received? Well, Nani was not impressed. He describes the copper as substandard, full of impurities, and unworthy of trade. You did not do what you promised me, he says plainly. A sentence that echoes across centuries like the soft sound of a refund request being denied. And this isn't just about a bad product, it's about principle. Nani goes on to complain about the disrespect shown to his messenger, who, according to the tablet, was treated with contempt and sent away empty-handed. In a culture where hospitality and honor were tightly wound into the fabric of social contracts, this was no small slight. Nani's clay complaint is lengthy, meticulous, and just salty enough to make you grin. He doesn't threaten, but he does point out that he's filed this complaint not once, but multiple times. This isn't his first clay rodeo. Now imagine this. You've walked barefoot across a sun-scorched trade route, maybe 300 miles from Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, on Nani's behalf. You carry copper ingots. You expect a smooth exchange. And then you're met with bad attitude, bad merchandise, and possibly bad breath. all of which gets etched forever into a tablet. This is the earliest known case of, "I'd like to speak to the manager." But here's the real kicker. The tone is so modern. Not in language, of course, but in energy. You can hear it in your mind. "I have sent gentlemen like myself to collect the goods, only to be treated rudely. I am very disappointed." Historians still argue whether this was a personal letter meant to stay between the two men or a formal document designed for public shaming. Some scholars suggest it was handed to local officials for arbitration, an ancient Better Business Bureau. Others think it was never meant to be read aloud and may have served more as a personal release valve for Nanny's rising blood pressure. Regardless, it's survived. The clay has darkened with time, but the frustration remains evergreen. Even the shape of the tablet is poetic. Rectangular, thick, and just small enough to be tucked passive-aggressively into someone's hand. You step back and let the image settle. A man with a beard, somewhere around 1750 BCE, scribbling complaints with a stylus after a truly awful business trip. He likely paused halfway to drink watered-down beer, muttered to himself about unprofessionalism, and then got back to work with a scowl. And now, his words outlasted his copper. As the apprentices take turns mimicking the stylus movements, the scribe chuckles gently and shakes his head. "You think this is bad?" he says. "You should have seen the goat contract." You wander on, past more vendors, one shouting about high-quality barley, another selling amulets shaped like fish. In Mesopotamia, everything could be formalized on clay. Marriage agreements, tax notices, love letters, adoption deeds, even sorcery instructions. But complaint tablets held a special place. Why? Because they reveal the soul of a civilization, not its triumphs, but its pet peeves. A customer in ancient Sumer wasn't just a passive buyer. He was a participant in a divine marketplace. Trade was sacred. Weight standards were watched by the gods. And if you broke the unspoken rules of fairness, well, you might get called out in baked clay. And you might lose your future customers. But of course, it wasn't just Nanny. Other fragments hint at similar frustrations. Workers scrawling about missing wages, farmers grumbling about stolen boundary stones, one tablet even detailing a stolen goat where the owner strongly suspects the neighbor but can't prove it. The tone? Disappointed, but dignified. You pause beside a low table covered in shattered tablet fragments, their characters still faintly visible. One shard, no larger than your palm, contains the words, "He said he would return, but he did not." It's unclear whether the speaker means a debtor, a friend, or a very flaky priest. But the sentiment? Timeless. Clay complaint culture wasn't just about venting, it was about setting expectations, preserving fairness, keeping a record in case, say, someone denied the whole thing a week later, and it worked. Because once a complaint was written and dried, it couldn't be deleted. Ancient receipts never disappeared into a spam folder. You find a quiet bench carved into stone and sit for a moment. A warm breeze lifts the edge of your robe, and somewhere nearby, a potter is laughing. The city is alive with transaction, with negotiation, with quiet fury disguised in the pleasant baritone of polite commerce. In Mesopotamia, words mattered, even angry ones, especially angry ones. The midday sun dips behind a passing cloud, casting long shadows across the baked mud bricks of Ur's residential district. You wander slowly now, your steps softened by the dust beneath your sandals. There's a rhythmic tapping somewhere in the distance, a stylus at work, pressed to fresh clay. It echoes like an ancient metronome, the steady beat of a civilization documenting its every grumble, barter, and bureaucratic hiccup. You've seen the most famous complaint tablet by now, but you're starting to realize that Anasir wasn't some rogue merchant operating without oversight. No, the ancient Mesopotamian economy, particularly during the Old Babylonian period, was a full-blown machine of contracts, receipts, shipping manifests, and yes, consequences. You step through a narrow doorway into a dim archive room. It's cool inside, the thick walls keeping out the heat. Rows of clay tablets organized in baskets and shelves sit like quiet witnesses to millennia of small frustrations. This is where scribes earned their bread. literally and figuratively. The scribal profession in Mesopotamia wasn't just respected, it was essential. These weren't just secretaries. They were lawyers, accountants, and journalists rolled into one. Want to buy a field? You need a scribe. Want to sue your neighbor for stealing your cow? Scribe. Want to send a poetic breakup note that doubles as a property division notice? Scribe, again. You run your fingers over one such tablet. The cuneiform is neat, the spacing generous. It details a dispute over a shipment of sesame oil that was too rancid for divine offerings, which is probably the ancient equivalent of being sent expired canola oil right before a religious ceremony. The tone? As prim and pointed as Nanny's. And the system supported it. Complaints weren't just tossed into the wind. There were judges, yes, literal judges, tasked with evaluating disputes like these. Some of them sat beneath shaded awnings in city courtyards, chewing dates and weighing cases, sometimes with witness testimony, sometimes with clay documentation alone. Historians still argue whether these judges were truly impartial or more like respected elders with a flair for negotiation. But one thing's for certain, the more clay you brought to support your story, the better your odds. Documentation was power, even petty documentation, which brings us to the odd little fact that some households had their own tiny archives. Yes, personal libraries, not of philosophy or poetry, but of grievances. You pass a broken door frame and peek inside a private home. There's a recessed wall shelf holding several tablets, and one in particular catches your eye. It reads, more or less, I did not receive the goat I was promised. The goat was not white, it was gray. I want my agreed goat. And you feel that deeply. You take a slow breath. The air smells of clay and faint smoke, maybe from a nearby cook fire. In this world, bureaucracy wasn't a slow grind, it was a living pulse. Everything was written down. When the rivers rose too high, someone noted the flooding. When temple rations came up short, it went on clay. When someone borrowed a donkey and returned it, missing a leg, that too was logged. There's one particularly delightful document you remember hearing about, a complaint from a delivery driver who was attacked by a dog while attempting to deliver grain. The message is simple and strangely relatable. I was bitten. No one helped. I delivered it anyway. You smile. Because honestly, who among us hasn't done their job while muttering internally about everything going wrong? Even wages weren't immune to drama. Scribes sometimes penned complaints on behalf of temple workers who hadn't received their monthly barley allotments. The barley was delayed. I had to borrow. I am hungry. It's heartbreakingly matter of fact. But it wasn't. All doom and gloom. Sometimes a complaint letter had a tinge of sass. One tablet, possibly written by an overworked bureaucrat, ends with, "Do not delay. I have many things to do," which feels like the ancient equivalent of, "per my last email." And here's a curious tidbit. Scribes were trained on model texts, many of which included complaint formats. That's right. Students learned to write by copying sample rants. The Mesopotamian equivalent of typing practice was, essentially, the copper was inferior. The servant was rude. I am displeased. It's strangely beautiful, isn't it? You move deeper into the archive, where light filters in through a slatted window. More tablets rest here, crumbling slightly at the edges. You pick one up, carefully, and recognize a different tone. It's a complaint. About a complaint. Yes, a man named Erdingir is writing to say that the previous complaint lodged against him was unfair. He insists the grain was weighed properly, and that the merchant in question is not a reasonable man. This is the earliest known version of "Don't believe everything you read online." Historians debate the outcome of that little spat. No ruling has been found. Did they shake hands? Did someone end up with 3 goats instead of 5? No one knows. But the back and forth was preserved forever, etched into the earth's memory. Outside, a bell rings. Somewhere, a priest signals that the afternoon ceremony will begin soon, and for a moment the city's busy hum slows. You step outside again, letting your eyes adjust to the sunlight. A breeze picks up the scent of roasting fish and dates. You pass by a low table where a young boy practices cuneiform on a damp lump of clay. He's repeating lines, possibly dictated by his teacher. You catch the words, "If the merchant is late again, I will report him." You nod in approval. The future of consumer advocacy looks strong, and as you walk, you begin to understand. In Mesopotamia, writing was never just for stories or the gods. It was for life. And life, no matter the century, is full of small disappointments and mildly annoying neighbors. But here, every sigh, every eye roll, every muttered, "Ugh, not again," had the potential to become immortal. The afternoon sun sinks lower as you drift toward the city's outer lanes, where the air feels less dense and the breeze carries the scent of river reeds. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats indignantly, possibly in response to having its agreed-upon color questioned. You smirk. Still thinking about that complaint tablet, aren't you? But now your feet take you toward another layer of this clay-covered world, one that's harder to read, even when the writing is right in front of you. Because not all complaints were recorded in stern, standardized Akkadian. Some were sarcastic, some were subtle, and some were downright poetic. Yes, poetry. Welcome to the next strange twist in Mesopotamian documentation. Complaint letters that sometimes double as low-key art. You step inside a scribe school, a low building with packed earth floors and faintly scratched walls. Students once sat here, with wax tablets or balls of clay, squinting through heat and repetition. A tablet on a shelf near the door catches your eye. It's longer than the others, its lines flowing like a hymn. At first glance, it reads like a lament to the gods, but then, wait, it's not about divine injustice or mortal suffering. It's about bread, specifically, the lack of decent bread at a recent feast. The writer is livid, though elegantly so. They describe the bread as so hard it mocked the jaw, and the honey as thick as temple incense, which, if you're reading between the lines, suggests someone's party didn't quite deliver. This is a literary complaint. Mesopotamian scribes were trained to master not just content but tone. They could craft a biting sentence so beautiful it almost sounded complimentary. Some scholars today wonder, were these poetic letters actual grievances or just exercises? No one can say for sure. Historians still argue whether this bread poem was penned by a hungry guest or by a snarky apprentice testing his stylus. Either way, it got preserved. And thank goodness it did. Not all poetic complaints were about food. One, written in the form of a pseudo-prayer, sarcastically thanks the god Enlil for bestowing upon the writer neighbors with no understanding of fence boundaries. You chuckle. Passive aggression truly transcends millennia. As you stroll between broken pillars and low garden walls, you imagine what it would be like to receive one of these letters. To have someone sit down, light a small oil lamp, and compose a clay-etched roast with the elegance of a temple hymn. It's charming, but also a little terrifying, because once something is on clay, it's permanent. And that permanence seems to be the point. You pass a small plaza where merchants once bartered for beer, barley, and wool. Arguments surely flared here too, maybe even resolved themselves before styluses got involved. But for every 10 squabbles that faded, one made its way to a scribe. You see a fragment lying forgotten in a planter. It reads simply, "Your price is a joke." The joke is not good, perfect, just perfect. Nearby, a school tablet lists practice sentences. Among them, "The wall was built poorly," and "His donkeys are loud." You smile again. Because somewhere between learning complex grammatical structures and copying royal decrees, scribes practice the real art of ancient life, airing one's mild grievances with maximum flair. You start to wonder how these tablets were delivered, and here's the next strange and delightful tidbit. Mesopotamians didn't have a postal service like ours. If you wanted to send a complaint, you probably had to hire a messenger, or hand-deliver it yourself. Imagine storming over to your copper merchant, handing him a carefully composed clay rant, and just waiting. Would he read it aloud? Would he scoff? Would he, like Ea Nasir, throw it into a back room and pretend it never arrived? Some tablets even seem to anticipate this. One letter opens with, "Whether or not you listen to this, it must be," said. Iconic. And sometimes the poetic flair wasn't even necessary. Some writers went full drama. There's a famous tablet that opens with, "You have made me weep." That's it. Straight to the point. No context, just vibes, and presumably, tears. You pause by a cracked irrigation trough where water once channeled life across this sun-baked city. The Mesopotamians didn't just invent writing, they invented the impulse to make writing feel good, cathartic, stylish, even performative. And yet, behind every polished complaint was a person. A merchant who felt wronged, a laborer who didn't get his fish, a priest who thought the temple milk was too warm. People used these poetic grievances not just to get justice, but to be heard. And being heard, even through a lump of drying clay, might have been the most powerful thing of all. As evening shadows begin to stretch long and golden across the brick-lined paths, you imagine this. A young scribe, after a long day of accounting and law copying, sneaks away to craft a private message to a rival. He writes with flair. He rewrites it for rhythm. He reads it aloud once, smiling. Then he presses the stylus down. Hard, permanent, and still, 3,000 years later, you're reading it. By now your feet know the rhythm of You've seen the docks, the dusty market paths, the places where artisans hammer their lives into copper and wood, and the corners where scribes dream up beautifully worded jabs. Tonight, as twilight descends, you drift toward a quieter part of the city. The air is cooler here. You pass doorways with drying herbs, walls painted with simple murals, and the occasional stray goat who clearly believes he owns the street. This is the neighborhood where the scribes live. Not the high-ranking temple elites or royal secretaries, but the everyday stylus wielders, the ones who make complaint letters happen. And that's what this section is really about. Who exactly writes these things? You might assume the angry customer, the copper buyer, the short-changed baker, is the author. But in most cases, they weren't. They hired someone to do it for them. A professional scribe. In ancient Mesopotamia, writing was like wizardry. Only a sliver of the population was literate. So if you had a complaint worth baking into clay, you'd need a specialist. Scribes, in many ways, were the ancient equivalent of modern customer service reps. If customer service reps also doubled as poets, lawyers, accountants, and sometimes astrologers. You duck into one of the small workshops. A windowless room with a reed mat, a clay shelf, and a wooden desk that's warped from decades of elbow weight. On the shelf sit tablets in various stages of drying. One is shaped like a palm, another like a small pillow. Scribes liked variety. On the wall, a wooden stylus rack holds tools in different widths, thick for headers, fine for insults. A middle-aged man sits nearby, chewing date pulp as he inspects a new commission. You lean closer. The client wants to complain about a shipment of spoiled fish. Not a glamorous job, but a necessary one. This scribe considers his words carefully. The fish did not smell fresh, he mutters, then crosses it out. Too mild. They reeked of death and dishonor. Better. Scribes were trained in nuance. Their schooling began young, around age 5 or 6, and involved years of memorizing logograms, mastering grammar, and reciting copybooks until your hands cramped. You didn't just learn to write, you learned what writing was for. And complaints? Complaints were art. You watch as the scribe molds a new tablet from a loaf-sized lump of fine clay, smoothing the edges with a wet hand. He begins, "To the fishmonger. Gamilu, may you know the displeasure of my household." You raise your eyebrows. A strong opening. The letter goes on to describe the odor, the color, even the reaction of the neighbor's cat, which reportedly fainted. Unconfirmed, of course, but this is the scribe's job, to dramatize reality into persuasive, clay-bound indignation. Sometimes the tablets would include not just words but drawings, rude little caricatures of the accused, sometimes with exaggerated noses or oversized sandals. Scribes rarely signed their work, but their style showed through. Historians still argue whether scribes had signature tones, like modern authors. Some tablets suggest recurring phrasing or structure, as if certain scribes had favorite insults. Imagine being known around town for your biting closers, "May your roof always leak," or "May your bread remain unbuttered." But not all scribes were bitter artisans. Some were pragmatists. They wrote polite, measured notes designed to resolve, not escalate. "I send greetings. The copper you sent is smaller than agreed upon. Let us resolve this in good faith." These were the white glove letters. Then there were the freelancers, scribes without a steady employer. They might linger in public squares or near city gates, offering quick tablet services to travelers or farmers in a rush. Speedy maybe, but not always reliable. Some clients later complained about their complaint letters. The irony. As you move on, you glimpse another scribe school across the road. There, students are hunched over small clay rectangles, practicing their signs. One boy writes, "Goat, goat, goat," over and over again. Another mutters, "About bread weight discrepancies." Perhaps they're rehearsing tomorrow's market argument already. You remember, not all scribes stayed in cities. Some traveled with military units or served as tax collectors, managing records in border towns or hilltop forts. Even in the most remote corners of the empire, where beer was scarce and lions were not, someone still had to file the paperwork, and paperwork included the occasional grumpy tablet from an officer who didn't receive his barley ration. Here's the fringe tidbit you've been waiting for. One scribe, likely exasperated by endless complaints, reportedly added a final line to a letter reading, "If you respond, I won't be reading it." Bold, petty, timeless. As the street darkens into hush and firelight, you pass by a cracked wall painted with a faded line of cuneiform script. It reads, "Words are heavier than bricks." A scribe's motto, maybe, or just a reminder to choose your insults wisely. You step back into the lane, dust clinging to your ankles, the sound of a distant flute echoing from an unseen courtyard. You realize something calming. Every angry letter you've read so far, every fish complaint, every copper rant, every sarcastic bakery review, it all passed through the careful hands of someone like this. A tired, ink-smudged scribbler of human grievances. They took someone's indignation and made it immortal. And tomorrow, when some goat buyer feels cheated, they'll be back. Stylus ready. You linger in the hush of the scribe's quarter just long enough to hear the end of a lullaby drifting from an open window. It's gentle and off-key, the kind of song meant to lull children, or perhaps anxious adults, into sleep despite the clamor of city life. But you're not sleeping yet. You're heading to the heart of the drama, the merchants. Because as poetic as these complaint letters might be, they start with goods: copper, wool, wine, lapis lazuli. Actual things moving from one dusty place to another in carts, on boats, or balanced atop groaning donkeys. And where there's trade, there's tension. You walk now toward the merchants' district, feet stirring up clouds of silt. The streets here are wider, lined with stalls that, during the day, bustle with customers and full-volume haggling. But by this hour, the sellers have packed up. In their absence, the wooden counters resemble closed mouths after an argument, silent but ready to reopen. Here, in these very lanes, the grievances were born. A man thinks he bought 1 shekel's worth of olive oil but finds half water in the jar. A woman receives linen that's half the thread count promised. A copper buyer opens a shipment and sees rust, not shine. And while we today might post a snarky review online, they had clay tablets and strong feelings. One of the most famous examples? The infamous complaint tablet to Ea Nasir. You duck under a reed awning into the cool, dusty front room of a merchant's old house. You can picture it, sun streaming in through slatted shutters, the smell of dried fish and imported myrrh in the air, and in the center a stout man with furrowed brow, Ea Nasir himself. He's an actual historical figure, a copper dealer whose reputation lives in infamy thanks to a beautifully worded tantrum from a client named Nanny. Now, to clarify, Ea Nasir wasn't necessarily a fraud. He traded across long distances, probably dealt with difficult suppliers, and maybe even had some decent deals in his early days. But boy, did he disappoint. The complaint letter to him, preserved beautifully in clay, spares no feelings. Nanny writes, When you came, you said to me as follows: I will give fine copper ingots. You left, but you did not do what you promised me. It goes on, and on, and on. Nanny even mentions how his messenger, sent to collect the copper, was treated rudely and sent home empty-handed. A sort of ancient Amazon dispute resolution gone horribly wrong. The letter is laced with weary sarcasm and understated fury. It ends with a flourish that modern customer service reps would recognize instantly. I will not accept any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you treated me with contempt. Boom. Mic drop. Clay baked. Historians still argue whether Nasir was uniquely bad at his job, or if Nani was just extra dramatic. Some suggest the whole exchange was part of an ongoing business relationship gone sour, like two frenemies locked in an eternal trade war. Here's the quirky tidbit. Multiple complaint tablets addressed to Nasir have been found. He was, quite literally, that guy everyone wrote angry letters to, possibly the most complained about man in ancient Mesopotamia. And you can't help but wonder, did he keep those tablets in a little basket? Did he roll his eyes at them? Did he, in a moment of wounded pride, compose responses that archaeologists just haven't found yet? You pass what's left of an ancient merchant stall. Bits of broken pottery glint in the sand. Some were probably containers for sesame oil or barley malt. Nearby, a stray cat stretches luxuriously, as if the spirit of some ancient trader lives on in its disdainful yawn. This was the world of slow, often unreliable commerce. Goods arrived late, spoiled, short-weighted. Coins didn't always match promises, and when tempers boiled, the buyers turned not to violence, but to styluses, because in this society, dignity was preserved not by yelling in the streets, but by calmly detailing your grievances in perfect cuneiform, then slapping that sucker into the hands of a courier who'd march across town and deliver it with just the right amount of disdain. It's oddly elegant, and it makes you realize something. The act of complaining wasn't just functional, it was cultural. To write a complaint was to assert yourself within the tangled web of honor, trade, and reputation. Merchants were expected to defend their name. A good one would respond, maybe even apologize. A bad one? Well, Nasir. But complaints weren't only limited to merchants. Some letters record issues with temple workers, hired laborers, or boat captains who took suspicious detours. One clay tablet even reads like an early version of "My Uber driver wouldn't stop texting." But here, among the trade houses and closed-up stalls, the merchant is the central figure, the fulcrum of Mesopotamian frustration, and somewhere, maybe behind a high wall or curled up under a woven blanket, Nasir sleeps, unbothered, or so he wants you to think. You smile to yourself, because deep down, you know he probably winced every time a new courier arrived with a fresh slab of fury. And really, isn't that kind of comforting? Even in 1750 BCE, people just wanted what they paid for. You continue meandering through the moonlit alleys, where the echoes of distant drums fade into the background like a forgotten lullaby. The merchant quarter gives way to another neighborhood, quieter now, but still pulsing faintly with stories. This is where the administrators lived, the number crunchers, the grain counters, the human spreadsheets of ancient Mesopotamia. Their world was made of numbers, but their nights, often interrupted by complaint letters. Because for every angry customer like Nanny, there had to be someone on the other end of the equation, someone to open the complaint, log it, and pretend to care. You stroll past what would have once been a small archive room, the scent of baked clay long since faded into dust. Here, dozens, maybe hundreds of tablets were once stacked like filing folders on wooden shelves. Most weren't complaints, to be fair. Some were tax records. Others were temple donations. A few were love letters, surprisingly sweet and full, of awkward metaphors, but tucked among them. A handful of tablets dripping with passive aggression. See, after a letter was delivered, say from a furious customer, it didn't vanish into the ether. It entered a system. Maybe it was read aloud in a public forum. Maybe the recipient hired a scribe to copy it. Maybe it sparked a quiet backroom debate. Should we refund this guy's copper or just ghost him? Historians still argue whether most complaints were taken seriously or simply served as emotional venting. Some believe that responding to them was expected as a form of honor. Others argue that they were a sort of performative ritual. Everyone complained, everyone ignored the complaints, and the system trundled along regardless. But in the best cases, complaints were documented, stamped, and stored. Here's where things get oddly modern. You round a corner and spot the ruins of a ziggurat in the distance, silhouetted in the night. Not far from it would have stood the Grand Temple Archives, a precursor to bureaucratic heaven. Inside, scribes used their days to write out everything from birth records to shipping manifests. And among their tasks, cataloging those ever-persistent complaint letters. It's worth pausing here to admire the Mesopotamian filing system. It wasn't just shove tablet on shelf and hope. No. These ancient record keepers were meticulous. Some tablets had numerical tags etched into their sides. Some were wrapped in clay envelopes. Yes, actual clay outer shells, with summaries of the content on the outside. If you wanted to complain in style, you'd commission a double tablet, the original plus a sealed backup, just in case someone mysteriously lost the first one. And what's more amusing, some scribes couldn't resist editorializing. A few added little flourishes like urgent or regarding substandard copper again. You can almost imagine a weary administrator muttering, "Ugh, not this guy again," as he shelves another complaint from Nanny. One particularly delightful clay fragment records a note of annoyance from an administrator about a farmer who kept demanding more irrigation water than his allotment. Not only did the scribe document the complaint, he also added a thinly veiled eye roll at the end, suggesting perhaps he should focus on plowing more and writing less. Quirky tidbit. Some temples even used stylus marks to track when a complaint was received and when it was resolved, kind of like an ancient ticketing system. Picture a sleepy scribe looking at a tablet and muttering, "Nanny's copper issue, still pending." And when a complaint was resolved, another tablet might be issued, bearing something like a receipt. These weren't flowery, just brief notes. Complaint regarding delivery delay, item replaced. You suspect these were never as satisfying as the original angry letters. But hey, closure is closure. You reach a low wall and sit there for a moment, watching shadows sway across the sand. The stillness of the night has an almost reverent quality, like the world is pausing to remember just how much paperwork it takes to run a civilization. And Mesopotamians were nothing if not methodical. Their complaint process wasn't just about whining. It was embedded into a broader administrative machine that prized order, documentation, and yes, even the occasional poetic roasting of a business partner. By now you realize, to file a complaint in this world was an act of faith. Faith that someone was listening, that fairness mattered, that your words, etched into clay and carried by hand, might ripple through the corridors of a palace or temple and return with justice, or at least a slightly shinier copper ingot. You glance up at the stars, trying to imagine the life of a scribe tasked with reading these tablets by the flickering light of an oil lamp, bent over a desk of polished stone, eyebrows permanently raised, fingers stained with dust. They were the silent witnesses to all the drama, and let's be honest, some of them probably enjoyed the gossip. Did you see what Nanny said this time? Oh, it's a scorcher. He even called Ionisir's warehouse disorganized. Brutal. You chuckle softly at the thought. There's a strange comfort in realizing that thousands of years ago, humans were already knee-deep in petty squabbles, tedious logs, and semi-professional complaints. Not because they were petty, but because they cared. About quality, about fairness, about being heard. And really, isn't that all any of us want? You lie back against the stone, arms behind your head, and close your eyes. If you listen closely, you might still hear the soft scratch of stylus against clay, or maybe that's just your imagination. The stars glimmer overhead like grains of barley scattered by the gods, and the night is quiet. So quiet you swear you can hear the slow exhale of a clay kiln cooling somewhere far off in time. You stir gently, brushing a bit of imaginary sand from your sleeve, and resume your quiet stroll through the labyrinthine ruins of Mesopotamia's scribal heart. Because tonight, you're still chasing the afterglow of a very ancient form of rage, tidily, pressed into mud and baked into history. Now that you've seen the machinery behind the complaints, the scribes, the archives, the administration, you might be wondering, how widespread was this practice? Was Nanny just one grumpy guy with a stylus, or was there an entire culture of formalized whining? Well, grab your mental walking stick, because we're headed toward one of Mesopotamia's busiest hubs of trade and tension, the bustling crossroads of ancient Ur. You feel the tempo of the city pick up again as you imagine the streets of Ur in full swing. Merchants calling out, wheels clattering, the smell of roasted barley cakes wafting from a nearby stand. Ur was no sleepy village. It was a teeming metropolis, one of the largest cities of its time, with tens of thousands of residents and traders flooding in from all directions. With all that activity came drama. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that complaint letters were practically a genre in Ur. Historians still argue whether this was a result of higher literacy rates among merchants or simply the sheer scale of economic interaction, but what's clear is that Ur had its own signature style of griping. The tone of these letters was often less poetic than earlier ones, more direct, more transactional. Think of them as the "I need to speak with your manager" era of cuneiform. Still politely phrased, sure, but with that extra edge of "I know my rights." In one famous case, a merchant complained not about a delivery, but about how his goods had been stored upon arrival. The warehouse was, in his words, unfit for dried fish, which is possibly the Mesopotamian version of "this place smells like feet and despair." He went on to describe how the barrels had been stacked improperly, and that rats, yes, rats, had chewed into his product. There's no word on whether the complaint was addressed, but the man did write another letter a week later, so maybe not. These grievances weren't limited to merchandise. People complained about contracts, about marriages, about boundaries of property lines. One amusing tidbit found on a clay fragment details a man lodging a complaint because his neighbor's goat kept eating his wife's laundry. You can almost picture the look of eternal frustration on that poor man's face every time he saw yet another half-chewed tunic. And here's where things get really fascinating. Some complaints were preserved not as isolated tablets, but as part of a court record. Yes, dear listener, Mesopotamia had small claims court. You pass a shadowy alcove where, once upon a time, citizens gathered to air their grievances before appointed judges. These judges, often temple officials or city elders, would hear complaints and render decisions. Some verdicts were etched into tablets, forming one of the earliest written legal archives known to history. Sometimes justice was served with the slap of a clay tablet. Other times, let's just say the outcomes were interpretive. A merchant might complain that his ox was stolen and request restitution, only for the judge to rule, cryptically, that what is broken will not be yoked. Interpret that how you will. Historians still debate whether such phrases were legal idioms, poetic refusals, or just ancient bureaucrats being extra dramatic. In rare but delightful cases, scribes recorded not just the complaint, but the full dialogue between plaintiff and defendant. These are goldmines of human behavior. There's sass, there's finger-pointing, and yes, there's passive-aggressive shade. One transcript ends with a line from a trader who says, "If my copper was so poor, why did he buy it 3 times? And honestly, fair point." By this point in the night, the complaint letter is starting to look less like a novelty and more like a cornerstone of ancient civic life. It wasn't just a way to vent, it was how people carved out their place in the social order. Even the gods were known to complain. Sort of. In one mythological hymn, the goddess Inanna delivers a fiery speech about being denied entry to the underworld. It's not technically a complaint letter, but it does read like someone about to ask for a supervisor. And the fact that divine figures echoed the rhythms of formal grievance suggests that the structure of complaints was deeply embedded in the culture. And this is where your night journey takes a strange and beautiful turn. Because in Mesopotamia, to write a complaint wasn't always a solo act of frustration. Sometimes it was a performance. Scribes would read these letters aloud in public. Audiences would gather. Reputations were made or broken based on how cutting, how clever, how righteous your letter sounded. One traveler even wrote home about a letter night where merchants shared their most outrageous exchanges for laughs. Imagine that. A society where the art of the complaint was not just a survival tactic, but a celebrated genre, somewhere between slam poetry and customer service training. You let out a sleepy chuckle. It turns out Nanny wasn't just mad. He was participating in a grand tradition of civic theater, a centuries-old dance of blame and barter. You look around once more as the moon shifts behind a cloud. The city is quiet now. The last of the ghostly traders has vanished behind closed mud-brick doors. Even the imaginary goats have gone to bed, but the letters remain, stacked in dusty alcoves, buried under layers of history, or sitting in museum drawers a world away. They whisper of copper, of rats, of soggy laundry, and broken contracts. But more than that, they whisper of people trying to be seen, heard, treated fairly. Not so different from you and me, really. The stars have begun their slow tumble westward. Somewhere beyond this night, the first slivers of dawn are curling across the horizon. But you, still wandering the echoes of Mesopotamia, have one more stop before the journey ends, because you've seen the complaints, the letters, the bureaucracy, the courtroom drama. But now comes the question you've been circling all night. What happened to Ea Nasir? You remember him, of course, the villain of our tale, the copper dealer, the man whose name is forever preserved in 1,000 memes and one furious tablet. But unlike most viral figures, Ea Nasir was real. And according to the records, he was successful. In fact, Ea Nasir appears in multiple tablets, some transactional, some neutral, some downright boring. He wasn't a shady alleyway huckster. He was a proper merchant, part of a larger network, dealing in copper ingots imported from the Arabian Peninsula. He had his own house, archaeologists excavated it, a private warehouse, and a lot of business contacts. He also had complaints. More than one. Nanny's letter isn't an isolated outburst. Several other tablets reference poor quality copper, delayed shipments, or shady substitutions in Ea Nasir's dealings. If this were Yelp, he'd be sitting at about 2.5 stars. But here's the twist. He kept doing business. How? Simple. Ea Nasir operated in a world where relationships, not star ratings, drove commerce. Even if someone had a bad experience, they might come back, because he was the only supplier they knew, or because no one else had copper at the time, or because, like it or not, he was part of the tribe. He wasn't loved. He was tolerated. This says something profound about ancient systems of commerce. The idea of walking away from a business, cutting ties, or leaving a 1-star review was a luxury, something you could only do if you had alternatives. Most customers didn't. In that context, Nanny's letter takes on new gravity. It's not just a complaint. It's a risk, an escalation, a shot across the clay bow. By writing it, and writing it well, Nanny wasn't just protecting his pride. He was throwing down a marker. I'm not afraid to shame you in public. And that might have mattered, because in Mesopotamia, reputation was everything. Merchants operated on trust. If word spread that Ea Nasir's copper was sketchy, it might not drive him out of business, but it could cost him a contract, a shipment, or an ally. Nanny knew this. So while we don't know if Ea Nasir ever responded to the complaint, no rebuttal tablet has been found. We know one thing for sure. Nanny's words survived. Long after the copper was spent, the ingots melted, the house collapsed, and the city turned to dust. That letter remained. And isn't that the ultimate victory? You stand now at the edge of the dig site where Ea Nasir's house once stood. It's nothing more than low stone foundations and a few broken bricks. But archaeologists believe this was where he stored his goods, hosted his clients, and maybe, just maybe, received that infamous tablet. You imagine a messenger arriving at his door, clay letter in hand, eyebrow arched. From Nanny, the man says. Ea-Nasir groans, and somewhere in the distance, a scribe starts sharpening his stylus, because complaints, it turns out, are eternal. They outlast empires. They echo through time. They remind us that commerce is never just about goods. It's about people, about trust, about power, about the deeply human need to say, "You wronged me, and I want you to know it." You smile, because this journey began with a joke, an ancient complaint letter shared for laughs across the internet. But now it's a portal, a connection, a whispered conversation between you and a long-dead trader with very high standards. And maybe that's the real magic of the oldest customer complaint in history. Not that it exists, but that it still speaks. You step away from the ruins of Ea-Nasir's home, the imagined grumble of ancient copper merchants fading like the evening breeze. But Mesopotamia has more to whisper. Your feet shuffle softly across cracked clay and dust, and now you find yourself, not in a marketplace, but in a quiet, cool corner of an administrative building. Perhaps a temple archive, perhaps a merchant's office. Hard to tell at this point. What matters is what lies inside. More tablets, hundreds, maybe thousands. You can barely read the scribbles on most of them, but they're organized, stacked, filed, stored for someone to reference, perhaps generations later. This is no messy storage closet. It's a data center, an ancient one, made entirely of mud and intention. These, dear listener, are the records. And tonight, we dive into what those records tell us about bureaucracy in early Mesopotamia. See, the complaint letter from Nanny isn't a standalone oddity. It's part of a massive, humming, surprisingly detailed administrative culture that was already thriving over 4,000 years ago. If you think paperwork today is bad, imagine waiting on a shipment of barley, only to find the receipt buried in a stack of clay slabs, none of which have timestamps. But here's the twist. This system worked. Why? Because the Mesopotamians believed in writing everything down. You bought something? Tablet. You owed someone a goat? Tablet. You delivered bricks for a construction project? Tablet, and sometimes even a receipt of a receipt, just in case someone tried to stiff you later. And these weren't vague notes either. These were detailed, often incredibly specific entries. They included weights, quantities, descriptions, names of witnesses, sometimes even the names of the scribes, who had a sort of bureaucratic signature flair, like tagging the world's driest graffiti. One favorite gem among scholars? A complaint over the quality of sesame seeds. Not their absence, not even their price. Just the quality. Imagine being the guy who got that letter. "Dear sir, your seeds are tragically underwhelming. Please see to this." This wasn't just red tape for the sake of it. Writing created accountability. In a world where oral promises could vanish with the speaker, tablets were permanent, and this made Mesopotamian bureaucracy a system that could, within limits, scale. Temple economies expanded, land was allocated, taxes were collected, and yes, complaints were processed. Well, processed might be a generous word. There were no help desks, no soothing hold music. If you had a dispute, it might take months, or involve bribes, or simply fizzle out. But the fact that you could write it down and deposit it with an official body, that meant something. Of course, it also meant a whole new job class. Scribes. Now picture this. You're a young Babylonian with decent handwriting and a head for signs. You've been trained in cuneiform, maybe even got a scholarship from the temple to learn Sumerian legalese. You've made it. You're a scribe. Your job? To document everything. Complaints, deliveries, dowries, even love letters. Yes, those exist too. Ancient flirtation is absolutely adorable. Lots of poetic odes to the sweetness of your scent and "May Inanna guide your steps." That kind of thing. Scribes were the lubricants of the state machine. Without them, the whole thing would screech to a halt. And because they wrote everything, we now have a treasure trove of information about what life actually felt like. Not just battles or kings, but day-to-day stuff. Like how many fish a man owed the temple after a bad fishing season, or how often someone tried to sneak a little extra copper into a shipment and got caught. These tablets show us a society obsessed with record-keeping, and proud of it. But here's the delightful contradiction. Even with all this writing, many Mesopotamians couldn't read. Writing was elite, it was specialized, it was sacred. Which brings us to another mystery. Who exactly was the intended audience? For Nanny's complaint? Was it really for Eonisir alone? Or was it meant to be seen by others? Archived, referenced, used as leverage. Historians still debate whether Nanny was writing a legal document, or a shaming tool, or both. Maybe he hoped the temple officials would see it and revoke Eonisir's trade license. Maybe he just wanted future scribes to laugh at the guy. If so, well played, Nanny. It worked, and let's not forget, this wasn't anonymous feedback. No, dear sir or madam, Nanny names himself. He's emotionally invested. It's personal, which suggests one final layer of ancient bureaucracy: ego. Mesopotamian merchants were not just traders. They were reputational beings. They built alliances. They made enemies. They used writing the way modern influencers use public posts to shape narratives, protect status, and occasionally throw a little shade. So you walk now through the echoing silence of the archive. No whispering scribes, no rustling papyrus, just the hum of night and the gentle thought that maybe, just maybe, our obsession with forms, signatures, and a good paper trail isn't as modern as we think. It was all here. 4,000 years. Ego pressed in mud, sealed with a name filed under, "Please respond promptly or I will escalate." You shuffle further through this clay labyrinth of ancient records, careful not to trip over the scattered shadows of bureaucracy. The air grows denser with history, or perhaps just dust, but the silence is oddly soothing. Somewhere in the darkness, a distant drip echoes, like time itself remembering to check in. You're not alone in this archive, not really. You're surrounded by ghosts of transactions and long-settled disputes, the hushed voices of a civilization that really didn't want to be misunderstood. Tonight, let's peek behind the curtain of temple authority, the real power brokers of the age. If kings ruled the land, temple bureaucrats ruled everything else: taxes, trade, labor assignments, even ration distribution. And yes, that includes tracking who got what grain, how many fish were due on festival days, and which copper shipments mysteriously lost weight en route. Looking at you, Eonisir. Temples in Mesopotamia were not just spiritual hubs. They were banks, schools, libraries, granaries, job centers, and sometimes even courts. A kind of divine HR department, staffed by scribes who moonlighted as moral auditors. You can almost hear them. If it's not on the tablet, it didn't happen. What's especially mesmerizing is how these temple economies functioned. Unlike modern capitalism, Mesopotamian trade didn't always involve coin. Instead, the temples operated a redistribution system. Workers, whether shepherds, bakers, or weavers, were assigned quotas. They delivered goods to the temple, which then allocated supplies back out as rations. It's like being paid in barley, lentils, and wool, though occasionally for VIPs. There was beer, always beer. This meant that keeping accurate records wasn't just a matter of neatness, it was survival. Forgetting a sheep? That's temple property you've misplaced. Underreporting fish? That's sacred fraud, my friend. And here's the kicker: the complaint against Eonisir. It was likely submitted through temple channels. This makes the letter even more deliciously bureaucratic. Nanny wasn't just having a tantrum, he was leveraging an institution. He was saying, "Hey, this dude is dodgy and I have receipts," literally. It's like CCing your boss and HR on the same email, but instead of email, it's clay. And instead of sending, you stamp it, bake it, and store it with a priest. You might be wondering, with all this record keeping, did they have actual filing systems? Yes, and no clay tablets were grouped by topic or transaction type, sometimes with cylinder seals rolled across them for quick identification. They were stored in baskets, jars, shelves, whatever worked. Larger archives were arranged with surprising forethought, often with date ranges or location tags. But not everything survived. Historians still argue whether these storage methods were more ceremonial than practical. Was it about access or about permanence? Were they meant to be used later, or simply to exist as proof that the deed was done? In some ways, the tablets were a spiritual offering as much as a legal one. Writing, after all, was sacred. The act of recording wasn't just administrative, it was devotional. When you pressed stylus to clay, you were invoking order, making meaning, carving your truth into time. And that brings us back to something oddly touching: the humanity of it all. Yes, the Mesopotamians were obsessed with formality and inventory. Yes, they had a fixation on measuring things to the last shekel and the final fig. But within that obsessive bookkeeping, we glimpse real lives: a woman requesting extra rations because her husband died in a canal accident, a shepherd fined for letting his goats stray onto sacred barley fields, a potter negotiating extra straw because his kiln collapsed during a rainstorm, and always, always, someone grumbling about copper. These aren't just economic data points. They're mini-biographies, micro-dramas, and they remind us that even when people are operating within rigid systems, they find ways to sneak emotion into the margins. Nanny's letter doesn't just say, "You owe me better goods." It says, "You humiliated me." It's a flare of pride inside a page of procedure. A man, possibly sitting on a flat-roofed home near the river, probably fuming, probably talking out loud to no one, scratching his frustration into a tablet and thinking, "Oh, you're going to regret this, Ionasir." And now, thousands of years later, he's still being heard. There's something weirdly comforting about that complaints, however small, however specific, can echo across time and still feel relatable. That even in a temple bureaucracy designed to process humans, like numbers, the personality slipped through. You're still wandering the archive, by the way. Somehow the rows of shelves have grown longer, the shadows deeper. You brush your fingers across tablets still warm with ancient irritation. Somewhere nearby, a ghost scribe rolls his eyes and whispers, "That guy again?" You nod. Because yes, that guy. Still filing complaints, still remembered. And as the night hums gently around you, you realize that bureaucracy doesn't have to be boring. Sometimes it's where people leave the most honest traces of themselves. Just angry enough to write, just tired enough to send, just hopeful enough that someone somewhere might care enough to read, even if it's 4,000 years later. You keep moving through this maze of ancient bureaucracy, the soft echoes of clay tablets tapping gently in your imagination. But tonight, let's take a detour from the letters themselves and peek into the life of the scribes who crafted them. Those quiet, meticulous figures who transformed complaints and contracts into cuneiform impressions, often with no one to thank them. Being a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia was a prestigious but demanding profession. You wouldn't just be any average Joe scribbling idle doodles. You were trained in a specialized school, a kind of ancient university where you learned hundreds of signs and the art of wedge-shaped writing. The stylus was your pen, the clay tablet your canvas, and no margin for error. One slip, and the whole tablet might be ruined. Imagine a novelist forced to rewrite an entire chapter after a single typo. Your education could last for years, and the curriculum was intense. You'd begin with simple signs, practice repeatedly, learn to read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian, the two main languages of administration. You'd memorize lists, formulas, poetry, and, yes, the occasional complaint letter or business contract. It was a bit like being a lawyer, accountant, and poet all rolled into one. But this wasn't just a job. It was a lifestyle. Scribes were part of an elite class. They had privileges, better housing, better food, and social status. Sometimes they were even exempt from taxes. But with privilege came pressure. Errors could be costly, leading to disputes or financial losses, and the work was repetitive. You might spend hours copying the same ledger, day after day. Historians still argue whether scribes found this monotonous or meditative. There's a charming little anecdote tucked in the cuneiform archives. One scribe grumbled in a tablet that his hand was sore from so much writing. Yes, even back then, wrist cramps were a thing. Some scribes humorously signed notes like, "The hand of the tired scribe," giving us a glimpse into their world-weary wit. Scribes often worked in temple complexes or palace offices, surrounded by shelves of tablets. They were the knowledge keepers, the bureaucratic heartbeats of Mesopotamian civilization. Without them, the complaint letters, trade records, and legal codes would vanish into oral obscurity. And here's a fun twist. Some scribes doubled as poets and storytellers. They composed hymns, myths, and epic tales, like the famous Epic of Gilgamesh. So while your job might be to record a dull barley shipment, you might also spend free time spinning stories about gods and heroes. Talk about a multitasking gig. Your stylus could create worlds. Still, the daily grind was not without frustration. Imagine copying complaints about poor quality copper or unfair wages day in and day out. It might make you appreciate your job less, unless you had a secret stash of beer for morale. Speaking of beer, it was the official beverage of scribes. Yes, there was a beer allowance as part of their salary. Imagine that, your hard days. Work cushioned by barley brew, perfectly brewed by the temples themselves. But like any system, scribes had their quirks. Some tablets reveal scribal jokes and playful errors, hinting at a sense of humor beneath the strict discipline. One scholar even found a tablet where the scribe complains about a boss's poor handwriting, which sounds surprisingly modern. Despite all this, scribes were the backbone of Mesopotamian record-keeping. They ensured that complaints like nannies were not lost to time, giving voice to grievances that might otherwise have been silenced. And isn't that something? A man's frustration, a scribe's hand cramps, a complaint sealed in clay. These tiny threads weave into the vast tapestry of history, connecting us across millennia. So you continue wandering, feeling oddly grateful for those ancient scribes. They wrote not just for kings or temples, but for people like you and me, preserving stories that still matter. Even if those stories started with a grumpy letter about bad copper. You drift deeper now into the quiet hum of ancient Mesopotamian daily life, where the complaint letter itself wasn't just a legal formality, but a window into a bustling, noisy, sometimes frustrating marketplace of human interactions. Imagine yourself standing in a sun-dappled courtyard, the dust swirling lazily as traders haggle over dates and copper ingots, while in the background, the temple bell tolls a steady rhythm, marking the hours for work, prayer, and the occasional complaint. This was a world where communication wasn't instant, but letters carried weight, literal and figurative. Clay tablets, baked hard, were the emails of their day, slow but permanent. You might pause to admire the tactile feel of a well-pressed tablet, the imprint of the stylus, the smooth edges, and sometimes even the fingerprints of the writer. Every tablet tells a story, not just of words, but of touch and intention. Nanny's letter, the earliest known complaint, is a perfect example. He didn't just write. He crafted a message designed to be noticed, to provoke action. He included details of the transaction, clear accusations, and even a threat to future dealings. In some ways, it's surprisingly modern, like a customer review that still stings centuries later. But what about the recipients? What happened to Ea Nasir when he got this letter? We don't have a follow-up tablet, but historians speculate that merchants had to maintain their reputations carefully. The temple officials would have mediated disputes. A bad reputation could mean losing clients in this close-knit world. What's fascinating is how these complaint letters intersect with ancient legal codes. The famous Code of Hammurabi, for example, included regulations about trade, quality control, and merchant conduct. It wasn't just good manners, it was law. Complaints like nannies could potentially lead to legal consequences. Historians still debate how often these disputes escalated beyond letters to formal court cases. Beyond trade, these letters offer insights into the social dynamics of the time. Complaints weren't always about money or goods. Sometimes they reflected social tensions, family disputes, or labor grievances. The letters humanize a civilization often seen through the dry lens of archaeology and economics. One quirky tidbit: some complaint tablets include flowery language or curses to emphasize the writer's displeasure. May your house crumble. One scribe penned delicately, showing that even in complaint, people aim to sting with style. As you imagine the scene, you realize how much of our modern customer service frustrations echo ancient ones. Bad product, slow delivery, unfair treatment. They are timeless gripes, connecting us across 4,000 years. And so, you wander back through the temple halls, the sound of voices fading into the soft creak of clay. The complaint letters rest quietly, their sharp edges softened by time, waiting for the next curious soul to read them and remember that even the oldest civilizations had their moments of frustration and humor. As your mind settles in the gentle rhythm of these ancient stories, you find yourself reflecting on the enduring nature of human communication, how these simple complaint letters from thousands of years ago still speak to us, bridging the vast gulf of time. You've traveled through the bustling markets, peered over the shoulders of scribes, and even felt the quiet frustration of a man named Nani, far away and long ago. It's tempting to think that after thousands of years, these voices would fade into silence. Yet here they are, clay tablets immortalized in museums, whispering their tales of daily life, commerce, and conflict. They remind you that history isn't just dates and grand events, but tiny human moments. A dissatisfied customer, a worried merchant, a tired scribe, and now, as your eyelids grow heavier, the noisy world of Mesopotamia softens to a distant murmur. The sun sets slowly over the Tigris and Euphrates, casting long shadows on the mud brick walls. You imagine the cool evening breeze carrying the faint scent of baked clay and barley bread, the chatter of families winding down, the soft scratching of a stylus in a far-off room. Remember that, like you, these ancient people were trying to make sense of their world, to improve their lives through communication and understanding. And sometimes that meant writing a complaint letter, a modest act of asserting one's rights, of seeking fairness. So as you lie back, ready to drift off, feel the calm continuity of human experience wrap around you. The clatter of styluses on clay fades into silence. The ancient world exhales softly, and you follow its lead. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your thoughts settle gently into sleep, carried on the quiet voices of those who came before.